I'd just like to start by paying a tribute to UCET. I worked at the University of York, where I set up the PGC English course and was Director of Initial Teacher Training. Then I worked at Edge Hill University as Head of Secondary Education, which was the largest, I don't know if it still is, the largest secondary programme in the country. And then I went to, as Sean said, Kingston as Head of Education, Head of the School of Education. And UCET was always really important to me, both as a source of what was happening, about the latest advice, about how to interpret what was happening, and how to keep the show on the road, because I was during the very uncertain times of the move to school-based initial teacher training. And I finished in higher education in 2003, but I know that things are still complex, and I will refer to that in my talk. But I don't want to focus today really just on initial teacher training, A, because it's not my milieu anymore, and B, because you'll be doing that, I think, for the next 2 days. And I want to focus on teaching as a profession, and I want to ask the question about what sort of education world we're putting our beginning teachers into. So I'll start by a saying which is often used, but it's true nonetheless for that teachers are the most valuable resource in any education system. They need to be the best professionals that they can be, and they need to be more skilled and more knowledgeable, because the future is changing faster than we can conceive. So it's a truism, but none less true for that no education system can exceed the quality of its teachers. But there's a problem, Houston. In the introduction to the Teaching and Learning International Survey, which is a survey run by the OECD every 4 years, and it's a survey of, the Tally survey runs on different, it's every 2 years actually, and it runs on different issues, but every 4 years, the views of teachers across the OECD are collected as part of the survey. So it's a huge survey run in nearly all of the OECD countries. And the latest Tally survey, with data from 2017, was launched in June this year. And Andrea Schleicher, who's Head of Education at the OECD, and he's the curator of the PISA International League Tables, and he runs the OECD's International Education Department. So OECD is a huge database of information about different education systems in the different OECD countries, the teaching workforce, the views of students, the development of skills, and of course in December, the PISA International League Tables will be published on the 3rd of December, and that will be a cause of either great celebration or a wailing and gnashing of teeth in the national press. So it's a hugely powerful institution with a lot of information. And in the introduction to this year's Tallis survey about teachers, Angel Gurria, who's the chief executive of the OECD, said this: "The skills that students need to contribute effectively to society are in constant change. Yet our education systems across the OECD are not keeping up with the fast pace of the world around us. Most schools look much the same today as they did a generation ago, and teachers themselves are often not developing the practices and skills necessary to meet the diverse needs of today's learners." And I want to come back to that rather sober assessment later. So I went to the launch of the Tallis International Survey in London in June, and Andrew Schleicher was there. And he said of Tallis that it allows the voices of teachers to be heard. So what did teachers, and these are the voices of teachers in England, because Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland didn't take part in the Tallis survey for this time. So what do the teachers in England say about themselves and about their profession? So when teachers in England are asked why they want to join the profession, their response is strongly around a social mission. They want to make the world better, they want to make their pupils' lives better, and they want to provide them with the skills and abilities to lead successful and fulfilled lives. They want to influence the development of children and young people. And in particular, they want to help disadvantaged children to improve their life chances. So teachers want to make a positive contribution to society. It's a strong social mission which motivates teachers. Teaching is a first choice for 60% of England's teachers. That's just below the OECD average. The OECD average is just above 60% as teaching the first choice. But that's far behind, hugely below, countries where teaching is a first choice. So Shanghai, over 80% is a first choice. Finland, the most difficult profession to enter is a primary school teacher. Portugal, higher first choices, Japan and Russia. And that's interesting because, as I'll go on later in my talk, Japan has longer working hours than England's teachers, and working hours are a major issue. So what is it about Japan, even with the longest working hours in the OECD, which makes teaching a highly valued profession? Talis asked teachers about what do they do in the classroom, how do they spend their time, what practices do they use most frequently. And for English teachers, what they value very highly is classroom management. It's really important to them. They want their pupils to follow rules. They want their students to listen to what they say. They want to calm disruptive pupils and enable them to learn. And for teachers in England, good relations with their pupils are really important. And that matches what pupils said 2 years before. So pupils in the UK, and this was a UK survey of pupils' attitudes, pupils in the UK are much more likely to say than many other jurisdictions, my teacher cares about me, my teacher wants me to do well, my teacher cares about my future. And I think that's really important because, you know, good classroom relations, a sense that you are known, a sense that you are cared for, that strongly fits with the social mission of teaching. But it also means that it creates the conditions for better learning. And teachers in England and teachers in the UK are really good at that. Teachers in England are really good at exposition, explaining to students what they're going to learn. And they think it's very important to make bridges between old learning and new learning, so to explore how a topic that they've previously learnt actually fits into the new learning that they're going to undertake. They're very, very good at setting goals for their students. And all those are really, really very important things, and we should be proud of the things that our teachers are very good at. But teachers are less confident in England about what the OECD calls cognitive activation. And that's giving students tasks that enable them to think critically. They're less practiced at getting students to work in small groups to overcome problems without an obvious solution. They're less willing to give their students complex tasks without a straightforward answer. And they're less confident in presenting tasks to their students for which there is no obvious solution. And that perception, English teachers in England, not English teachers, teachers in England, their perception of their practice is correlated by PISA 2016, the Talis surveys, which asked lower secondary students, which in the OECD terms, 11 to 14 years old, they were asked how they learned maths. And the students in England said that the main strategy they used for learning maths was memorization. In fact, England came third, Uruguay came first, Ireland came second, and England came third for the use of rote memorization as a teaching and learning strategy. And the problem with that is that rote learning is very good for simple tasks like learning tables, but is much less effective the more complex the learning and the task that you want to undertake. And I was at the presentation of the findings, so I asked Andrew Schleicher, why is it that we're third in the league table of rote memorization? And this isn't in the report, but I wrote down immediately what he said. He said, you have a system which relies very heavily on exams. Exams focus on the reproduction, he said, of subject knowledge content. So why would teachers in England invest in cognitive elaboration strategies when there's such a focus on exams? But then he said, but in the real world, those problems are on the rise, those problems which are not easily solved, where there's no obvious solution. And he also said the kinds of knowledge which is easy to test is also easy to digitise. And that made me think of an international summit I went to 2 years ago. The summit is unique because it's got the education ministers of the top 25 performing OECD countries, but they can't attend the summit unless they take the trade union leader with them. So for the last 10 years, I've been sitting next to Nick Gibb. And let's say there's not been a meeting of minds. But 2 years ago, it's really interesting because there was the Deputy Education Minister for China there, and he was sitting next to the Education Minister for Flemish speakers in Belgium. So the Deputy Education Minister for China, his department has overall responsibility for 15 million teachers, 260 million students, and 514,000 schools. The Flemish Belgian speakers minister has responsibility for 84 schools and meets his head teachers 4 times a year, at which the Deputy Education Minister for China burst out laughing and didn't stop for a while, and then said, well, I can't do that, and then talked at length about the massive investment that China is making in online digital learning, in particular so that students in the rural areas get access to a broad and balanced curriculum. And he held up his phone and he said, in the future, knowledge content will be transmitted through this, and what we want our teachers to do is to make that relevant and accessible, but be assured we will ensure that all our students have access to this knowledge content. So the kinds of knowledge which is easiest to test is also, as Schleicher says, easiest to digitise. So the OECD thinks that we in England have a problem, and I agree with them, and I agree with the CBI, who also thinks we have a problem. And the problem is that our school leavers, there's a mismatch between the skills that our school leavers leave school with and the abilities they need in the modern world. And that was reinforced 3 years ago by a study, again by the OECD, which looked across the OECD countries and looked at skills acquisition amongst the workforce and amongst school leavers. And England was the lowest when it came to measuring the skills of 65-year-olds and the skills of 18-year-olds leaving school. The 65-year-olds, it was the only OECD country where the 65-year-olds had better skills than the 18-year-olds leaving school. So there is a problem. Schools need to prepare students more and more for rapid changes, to train for jobs which haven't yet been created, to tackle societal challenges that have not yet transpired and which are transpiring. I mean, I would just think the obvious one is climate change. To use technologies which have not yet been created or are in the process of being created. Schools need to prepare students for an interconnected world in which students understand and appreciate different perspectives and worldviews. They need to prepare students for a society where they will need to respect others, where they have different views from themselves and interact successfully with them. And they will need to prepare for a world where they will be required to mop up the mess that we have created and to take action towards a sustainable economic, social and political system, and to promote collective well-being. The OECD argues that educational success in this new and transformed world will increasingly not be about what we know, but about extrapolating from what we know and applying that knowledge creatively in new situations, creating value by connections between different fields of knowledge and ideas that previously seemed unrelated. In the new world, it will not be what we can do alone, but how we can collaborate with others to mobilise, share, and integrate knowledge. Now, before I am accused of what I too often am accused of quite erroneously, I would now like to underline, put in bold, and highlight, if I had any of those processes, the following statement. That does not mean that subjects are dead. Inventive, creative problem solvers know a lot about subject disciplines and their own in particular. You cannot teach skills in isolation. You must always teach something. But the value in the new world will not just be about what we know, but what we can do with what we know. And just to show yet again that there is nothing new under the sun, it takes me back to what Vygotsky said in the earlier 20th century, that what is known must be brought alive afresh in each knower by his or her own efforts. But if schools remain, and I think schools are becoming more focused on content knowledge, that which is easiest to memorise is also easiest to digitise. And that is an existential threat to the teaching profession, because digitised, outsourced knowledge could mean the less need for human teachers. So I have to ask, therefore, what conditions created this conundrum? What is the reality of teachers' professional lives? Well, TALIS this year shows that teachers in England come just behind Japan for working hours, despite a huge effort on the part of the government and the profession over the last 15 years to reduce teacher workload. It really hasn't been successful. Working hours indeed increased since the 2013 TALIS survey. So full-time primary teachers work over 50 hours a week. Secondary teachers work nearly 50 hours a week on average. Part-time teachers are working the equivalent of a full-time working week, over 35 hours. And I don't know if you, like me, have seen the new paid 4 days, working 5 days, so I can have a weekend phenomenon. Teachers going to 4 days so that they can have a day to do their work and then have a weekend. Now, where does this work happen? Because teachers in England have about the average OECD for classroom contact time, about 21.5 hours a week. That's not excessive. That's about average across the OECD. Where teachers in England clock up the hours is work double that amount of time spent on activities related to teaching, including planning, assessment, and data entry. So our teachers work about the average in classroom contact time, but spend double the amount of time in less activities round their teaching, preparing and assessing and data entry and others. And we talk to our members, we have over 400,000 members who are teachers. When we talk to them about workload, whenever we put out a survey about workload, we get thousands of responses within 24 hours, because however hard they work, teachers always want to tell you how hard they're working. And when we ask them this, they tell us very clearly that they do not value this work. Much of this work is not done to improve their teaching and their pupils' learning. It's done for someone else, for accountability purposes, so that teachers can prove to someone else, be that their middle leadership, senior leadership, or someone external, that they are actually teaching and that their pupils are actually learning. Excessive workload and the stress that this brings drives teachers from the profession. Now, we spend in England £700 million a year recruiting and training teachers. But that's like, at the moment, putting money into, if you put money into a colander, it would not come out if you put money. So what would you put money into that it would get lost? An incinerator, yeah. Colander or Sieve won't done it. But it's like putting money into an incinerator, because we have a huge recruitment and retention problem. And in fact, I think the retention problem now is even worse than the recruitment problem. So retention rates in England are really bad. And we've done research on this at the NEU, looking into government data, and we know that the retention problem is getting worse. 1/5 of newly qualified teachers qualified in 2015 are no longer working in state schools by 2017. Among the NQTs who graduated and started teaching in 2012, a third are no longer teaching 5 years later, and nearly 40% of teachers leave the profession within 10 years of qualifying. So within 10 years of qualifying, nearly half your teachers have left the profession. Some may return, but many will not. When school leaders were asked in this round of TALIS what was the greatest barrier to education quality, the one issue that they identified more than twice of any other OECD country was a shortage of qualified teachers. And TALIS reveals that it may not only be a problem with workload, but it also could be a problem about the way we look after newly qualified teachers. So England is unusual in that induction in the first year of teaching is very patchy. 30% of newly qualified teachers said they didn't receive any induction in their first year of teaching. And one really interesting TALIS finding is that England has a higher percentage of beginning teachers in the toughest and most challenging schools than across the OECD average. So the way that the OECD classifies those schools is a school where 30% of the pupils are from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, and schools where there are higher than average numbers of students without English as a first language and first-generation immigrant children from immigrant families. And that's where it's in those schools where over 30%, and it's in those schools where our beginning teachers are most likely and more likely to be working. All of which, excessive workload, lack of mentoring, and being placed in the most challenging schools, I think explains the very poor retention rates we have in England. Now, contrast that with a jurisdiction like Shanghai, where you can't get promotion to a senior leadership role without having worked and made a difference in a very challenging school, in particular schools in rural areas teaching poor children. It's also rational to conclude that if your working hours are excessive, you have less time and energy to commit to your own professional development. So teachers in the latest TALIS survey reported that the cost of CPD and a demanding work schedule are the greatest barriers to accessing CPD amongst teachers in England, much more so than in other countries. Now, the National Education Union is a major provider of continuing professional development. We spend over £2 million a year, both in staff costs and time and resources, in providing professional development for our members. And they tell us, and when we ask our members what they want, we try to provide it. They tell us that much of school-led CPD is too general, it's not targeted at teacher need, it's too remote from their classroom, and this also reflects funding and workload pressures. And that finding was reproduced in TALIS. So it's not just me with an axe to grind, it was also a finding that TALIS reproduced. So what can we conclude from TALIS? And what can teachers, from what teachers tell me as Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union? Well, the first conclusion, I think, is clear. We are not making teaching intellectually attractive enough as a nation. Andrea Slyker talks of industrial models of teaching and how these are not fit for the 21st century. If our teachers in the UK can't access the CPD they need and want, then two things happen. They become stale and tired because teachers without respite and without new input find themselves to be exhausted. And the second very bad consequence of that is teachers are not modelling for their pupils the benefits of lifelong learning. Too many of our teachers, and my members tell me all the time, they tell me this all the time, they're running on empty. Secondly, we are not involving teachers in education policy development. Teachers feel done to rather than done with, and the pace of change, in particular the breakneck speed of the revision of the national curriculum and the return to timed exams, 16 and 18, have been brutal. The third conclusion, CPD is drying up for teachers on the supply side and on the demand side. It's been a long time coming. The Ofsted in 2005 did a report called The Logical Chain, and the conclusions are the same now in 2019 as they were in 2005. So the issue of CPD and getting enough of it and getting the right quality are not new ones. But it's a particular problem in England where teachers say that CPD is too expensive and they're not getting what they need. And the consequence of that, of course, is if you don't get CPD, which challenges your conceptions, enables you to think creatively about your teaching, is that you teach as you were taught. And at a time, that's not sustainable at a time when the way we access knowledge, utilise it, and transmit it is being transformed. So the mismatch is getting bigger and bigger. The other conclusion is that teacher supply is constricted not only by not meeting initial teacher training targets, but also by teachers leaving. And the Education Policy Institute, who I think are the most exciting education think tank, and the reason why I think, really only set up in 2016, but produced fantastic reports. And the reason why I think their work is so outstanding is because they mine the National Pupil Database. They're the first education policy think tank for a long time who use big data and their reports on Ofsted, their reports on teacher supply, their reports on the structural system of schools in England and the successes or otherwise of academy, free schools and local authority schools. The range of reports they do are always informed by big data, and I think that's very exciting. And they make the point in their report on teacher supply that if teachers are leaving after between 5 and 10 years, then those are the very teachers who are needed to become the middle leaders in school, to become the heads of department. And we know it's that cadre of teachers who actually are most responsible for raising standards. The big mistake the government believes is it's all about school leadership. It's about middle leadership more than whole leadership. And the other thing which is happening, and we're finding increasing evidence of this in very young teachers, beginning teachers who've been in the profession 2 or 3 years, being dragged through capability because they've been given responsibilities for which they've never got the experience, nor the training, nor mentors. And we're seeing a huge increase in that. And that's just a brutal way to treat dedicated professionals, to blame them and to drag them through procedures when the system has not provided them with the support and the development. And they're being given responsibilities far too early in their careers for which they've neither the training nor the support, and they leave. It also means a teacher supply crisis, that teachers are teaching out of their subject areas. So 1 in 5 maths and English lessons are now taught by non-specialists. That's by teachers without more than a GCSE in maths and English. And here's the thing, disadvantaged pupils in challenging schools are twice as likely to be taught by teachers teaching outside of their subject areas than advantaged pupils in privileged schools. They're also far more likely to have inexperienced teachers, and this compounds disadvantage because if you are a deprived pupil in a challenging school, it is far more likely, indeed it's axiomatic, that you are likely to have less support at home, less social and cultural capital to make up for knowledge gaps. You need good teachers, you need experienced teachers, much more than your advantaged peers. It also means, in those challenging schools, which are disproportionately staffed by beginning teachers, that you're far more likely as a pupil to receive subject knowledge content transmission because those teachers are focusing on their classroom management and on their teaching, and they rely on their subject knowledge because that's what's going to get them through. So those students are going to be far less likely to get cognitive activation strategies. They're far less likely to get open-ended tasks where there's no clear right answer. They're getting less time to develop their own thinking, to articulate it verbally, to challenge, to investigate, to weigh sources of knowledge against one another and to collaborate. And yet those are the very skills which will give better equality of life chances for those disadvantaged pupils. So I conclude with what are the implications for policy in what I've just said. So the first is that England has to tackle its teacher supply and retention crisis head on. At the moment, it's tinkering around the edges. We have to make fundamental and radical changes to what we require of teachers. We have to have a much clearer conception about what teachers should do. And this is where I go back to Japan. Japan, the hours are longer, but teaching is a highly valued profession because in Japan, it's very clear teachers should be expert at their pedagogy and at their practice, but they are also leaders in their community. And it is expected that they will spend time with their pupils and working in their community. That is the social mission of teaching, combined with a pedagogical and subject mission as well. So they have a much clearer conception about what their job is, and that makes it a much more attractive job than teaching in England. But we have to, in England, refashion teaching as an intellectually challenging and interesting profession, away from what Andrew Schleicher calls the industrial production model, which sees teachers as widgets on a production line. And in order to do this, I would advocate that we need to focus clearly on initial teacher preparation. I think we need a fundamental look about the way we prepare teachers for the profession. Amongst the OECD, our primary teachers in England are less confident in their pedagogy and in the teaching the breadth of the curriculum than their international colleagues. And I think that's, everybody's working as hard as they can to give them these skills and abilities. But if they've got a short training course and then they're put into the most challenging schools, you can see why their confidence takes a knock. So I think we need to look much more carefully at a more integrated model of initial teacher education. We need to look at how students access initial teacher education. The National Audit Office report of 2017 said the initial teacher trainee market is far too confusing and students are not getting good information about what course would be right for them and what they would get from that course. That has not yet been corrected, so we need to look at that. The National Audit Office said that the way that the DFE does the teacher supply model means it's not good for long-term it's not good for the long-term health of providers because they're getting their targets, their numbers far too late, and they don't have that long-term investment guarantee. And as I know, as a head of education, going to a vice-chancellor and trying to argue why, yes, we are 500,000 in the red, but you've got to understand why. There's only so much you can do that before they start getting rather hardened to your arguments. So the NAO were quite clear that the DFE has to think much longer, much harder, and provide a much more sustainable teacher education model, which gives much better information to trainees and provides a much more sustainable basis for teacher training and development. But the single most important thing we have to do to reinvigorate teaching and to make it an attractive profession is to reduce workload. Because professionally unfulfilled, stressed and exhausted teachers are not good and a good advert for the profession. You know, if you ask a teacher, would they recommend teaching to their children? 30 years ago, they would. You ask them now, and I was in a room 2 weeks ago with 200 teachers, and I said, put your hand up, who would recommend teaching as a profession? And not one did. Not one. And when Nick Gibbs says to me, you're talking down the profession, I said, all right, you don't need me to do that. You've got 500,000 teachers telling their children and their friends what it's like. We have to reinvigorate teaching as an attractive, intellectually demanding, rewarding profession. That's what it should be. To do that, we need to reduce workload. And to do that, we have to look at the accountability regime in this country and its effects. For the NEU, that means a radical change of the assessment system. It means the abolition of school league tables and the abolition of Ofsted. Teachers report that the biggest driver of workload is in-school accountability measures, which are demanded of them by external accountability. In essence, for the last 30 years, we have been casting around looking for proxies to measure education quality, much of them focused on measuring teacher quality. This has led to a huge intensification of pointless work in the profession, a futile effort to measure without first constituting the necessary resource, the quality of teaching in schools. It's led to Ofsted frameworks which are frankly nonsensical. I remember very well 8 years ago, I was General Secretary of ATL then, we merged with the NUT to become the NEU. And I remember 8 years ago, we put on courses for our teacher members about how to demonstrate progress in 20 minutes. We had members banging down the door for them because that was what Ofsted inspectors were saying. When they come into your lesson, we want you to see demonstrating progress in 20 minutes. Ofsted will now tell us that's a myth. No, it's a reality. They just don't want to acknowledge their own past. So teaching and learning, however, is far too complex to measure in this way. But the issue is this: if you have a terrorised profession, if you have a frightened profession, school leaders handing down bureaucracy to record teaching and data drops to measure learning, all of which are invalid and unreliable, so that when the inspector calls, all is measured and correct, then that is not a climate in which professionalism can thrive. Professionalism does not thrive in a climate of fear, and many of our profession have been terrified, which means to say they have complied. This is not intellectually attractive work. It is exhausting, and exhausted and defeated, unable to fulfill the ethical impulse to which drove them to the profession, many teachers leave. This is not work which is central to the complex intellectual challenge which should be the work of teachers and lecturers. So I agree with Andrea Schleicher. The industrial model of teaching will no longer do. It didn't even do in the Victorian era. It didn't even do with sitting next to Nellie. It didn't even do with copying down on slates. Even the Victorians understood that this did not do. which is, of course, why they created the public schools, to get away from that model for the elite. So we need radical reform. If we don't get radical reform, we will continue to lose our teachers. We need to create a climate of trust in our profession and in our schools and in teachers. Trust for which it's not just blind trust. Trust in which teachers are accountable and schools are accountable in ways that matter and which mean and which will raise the quality of education. Until we do this, we will not make teaching intellectually attractive again. And that is important because it's going to get harder, not easier, to recruit teachers, particularly with the rising secondary school population. A profession mired in busy work, not done for oneself, is not attractive, and it does not feel to those immersed in it that it is a profession. So teaching, as a profession, cannot coexist with terrified school leaders and teachers, and this, more than anything else, is what needs to be radically changed. Thank you.
Mary, an awful lot to think about there. I think we'd agree with pretty much everything. Now, we've got quite a lot of time for questions, so if you'd like to put your hands up, we've really got questions for Mary, and I'll come to you with the mic, but please do say who you are before you ask your question. There must be lots.
Well, it's a bit of a... Do you want to just talk amongst yourselves for a minute or two and then come up with some questions? Yeah, go on.
Sean. You don't need to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much again for a fascinating and very comprehensive picture of a whole range of factors impacting on the profession, and particularly keeping people in it. My question is, do you think, and you mentioned multi-academy trusts a couple of times in there, do you think that they are in a systemically different position, an advantageous position, in terms of how they can offer career progression or support for teachers in a way that much smaller individual schools can't? And does that give a skew in the system that we have at the moment?
I think the answer to that is it varies. So if you look at the EPI report, that tells you that there's no difference in the attainment of pupils from either the academy or the local authority system. There are good performers and there are poor performers in both systems. Whether you get the CPD you want and need very much depends on the trust you're in. So some do provide very good CPD, which teachers want and need. Others, it's generic stuff, which is not what teachers want and need. And I think the problem is not so much whether it's a MAT or a free school or a local authority school. The problem is that if you're going to have a self-sustaining school system, and Justine Greening, when she was Secretary of State for Education, asked this question all the time. If you're going to have a self-sustaining school system, what do you do about the schools which are not self-sustaining? And that is what we haven't cracked. So when Michael Gove introduced his 2010 bill, that was done with the absolute belief that the system had the resources it needed to be improving, and that all it needed to be done was set free from the tyranny of local authorities and it would be transformed. 2 EPI reports on that have shown that that is not the case. So, and Justine Greening was really clear, what do we do about self-improving school system where it doesn't have the ability? It's also clear that the DFE is extremely concerned about the quality of school support. So you do have teaching schools, you do have teaching alliances, but schools in special measures overwhelmingly use private services. They use private providers, for which the DFE has no indication of their quality. And you ask schools in special measures or requires improvement, why do they do that? And they say, why would the school leader of the school in the leafy suburb down the road, how would they know about my school? Because the school in special measures are overwhelmingly schools in disadvantaged areas with challenging pupil intakes. If you want me to talk about the EPI findings about Ofsted reports of different schools that she did in 2016, I'll be very happy to do that. Do you want me to talk about that? Okay, so in 2016, EPI did a report. Ofsted, is there room to improve? It's one of the 3 they did in their first 6 months of existence, and they found this. that they used a measure of value-added progress, which was very robust, or value-added decline. It was a measure used over 3 years, and they did that to not have schools in their sample who just had a dip 1 year or just had a rise 1 year. So it was a 3-year measure of a 15 percentile, either rise or decline in value-added performance. And then and that was the basis of all the schools in the country. That's what, in England, that's what they did there. They took those out, they isolated those schools. And then they examined those schools against the Ofsted grades which had been awarded to them. And they found that schools in challenging areas with a disadvantaged pupil intake, over a period of 3 years, if they made a 15 percentile increase in value added and Ofsted came, they were still overwhelmingly likely to be judged in special measures or requires improvement. Similarly, those schools in advantaged areas with a privileged intake, if over 3 years they showed a 15 percentile decline in value-added progress measures, they were still overwhelmingly likely to be judged by Ofsted as outstanding or good. And the conclusion that EPI came to is that Ofsted are better at expecting schools on time than coming to a valid judgment about the quality of a school's provision. And that the pupil intake hugely disproportionately affected the Ofsted grade. And that the danger for this, they said, is that system leaders who are leading challenging schools in deprived areas and doing a brilliant job, they're not going to be chosen to be teaching schools or national subject leaders or the national leaders of education. And in that, the system is making a huge mistake, because we need our schools in challenging areas to be validated for the work that they do, because if they're not, if it becomes a career-threatening judgment, if you go to a disadvantaged school in a challenging area, then they're going to find it much more difficult to get leaders and much more difficult to get teachers. And that then leads to those children in those schools who most need experienced teachers and who'll stay there and commit. It leads them to be taught by newly qualified teachers lacking experience, and to be far more likely to be taught by teachers who are not qualified in the subject area. So you're far more likely to get a physics teacher in an advantaged school than you are in a disadvantaged school. Now, there's something wrong in that. There's something very wrong in that. Because if we say, with the decimation of children's mental health services, the decimation of speech and language therapy, the decimation of education welfare officers, the decimation of children's social workers, if we say, with child poverty rising by where a third of our children in our country have experienced or will experience child poverty, and we know that just one experience of child poverty has a massive effect on educational attainment, if the only social support left to them is the school, and the school is disadvantaged because it can't get the teachers and can't get the leaders and can't get the support, then those children are being triply let down. And we are not educating our pupils for a society in which all shall have chances. We're educating them for a society where some who already have the good luck will have much more of the challenges. I mean, it always amazes me that I am told by people who don't agree with me that whenever you do these statistics, they always point you to somebody who's succeeded against the odds. There's always one who's succeeded against the odds. And I ask, why is it that our most deprived and our most poor children have to be exceptional in order to live ordinary lives? We don't require our middle-class children to be exceptional, but we require our poor children to be exceptional to succeed. And we should not require them to be exceptional. We should be providing them with the means to succeed.
Do you have any other questions? I'll come. Then I'll come.
Sue Cronin from Liverpool Hope. Thank you, I really enjoyed it. Can I just pull two strands? You mentioned about, or sort of framed teaching as an intellectual endeavour, and about the importance of initial teacher education. So just like you to speculate a bit about how do we encourage more schools to include universities within that, within this work, because I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to persuade schools of the advantages from having partnerships with universities.
Should we take the second one? Yeah.
Hi, Rachel Lofthouse from Leeds Beckett. It's going to sound a bit trivial, but on Twitter you'd assume that there was a huge, very positive, buzzing culture of teacher CPD, which happens every Saturday, and there's often several conferences or events on a Saturday. Most of those are really quite cheap for teachers to attend. Most of the people who are providing the input are giving their time for free. Do we see that as a good thing, or do we see that as something which is evidence of an unsustainable system?
So I think any CPD, I mean, you don't know about the quality of that, but I think teachers getting together and talking about their practice is something absolutely good in that. We provide a lot of CPD on a Saturday, a lot of CPD in the evening. But we have to look at the reality of our profession. 76% of the teaching profession are women. The vast majority of those have caring responsibilities. And I think it requires an awful lot if you're full-time to be working over 50 hours a week and then required to give up your Saturday as well. So I think, yes, of course I've got no issue with that as well. I think that's great when teachers want to get together. But surely, if we're going to... why do we require our teachers to be just martyrs to their profession? You know, teachers need a home life. They need to be able to see their family. They need to be able to talk to their children. They need to be able to see their friends. They need to be able to have hobbies. They need to be able to keep fit. And yet I see too many teachers who are physically exhausted and mentally broken. Now, we have to take much better care of our teachers. We know, the Tally survey says that the CPD that teachers find most effective is to be collaborative with one another, to learn from one another. You can do a lot of that in school. So you can create the culture in school, you can, where teachers can collaboratively work together or between schools and work with each other. And that's really, really positive. And then have the input from universities, which I think, obviously, I worked in higher education for 12 years and nearly broke me. So, of course, I believe in that marriage of an effective theoretical... I mean, I remember doing my MA at the Institute of Education in London, and I remember coming across Vygotsky, and at first reading being completely nonplussed, and at second reading knowing that that would transform my practice. I remember Valerie Walkerdine and Girls in Mathematics, and looking at why girls were put in lower sets and thinking that I was a brilliant equal opportunity teacher, and then going in and taping my lessons and realising from the tapes that boys taught 90% of the time and quite a lot of the time taught rubbish, and having then to transform my practice so that I made sure that girls didn't whisper in the sidelines but learnt how to articulate their opinions and were centre stage. But I would say in order to do that, you need a confident system which has the ability not to be facing its third new Ofsted framework in 5 years. You know, you need a system which has a bit of a time and confidence to breathe and then look around it, and the confidence to believe that it has something to offer. And I think that the reason, I mean, I don't know, but I suspect that the reason why schools are not involving universities is because you can't give them, because you're not in the business of giving them, the quick-fire, sure-fire answer to an outstanding Ofsted grade. And if it's a school in a challenging area, you won't be able to give them that anyhow. I think that's why.
We've got time for a couple more, if any colleagues. Anyone? Yep. And one, then you.
So it's Frances Child from University of Birmingham. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed your talk. That seems like quite a strong call, perhaps to revolution rather than evolution, in how we...
I am a revolutionary.
In how we train our teachers. And I suppose just a reflection from me and really your thoughts. All the time we award qualified teacher status as well as our master's level qualifications, we're answerable to Ofsted and we need to work within frameworks and so on. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about how do we really get moving and in kind of making radical change in the ITE sector, given the constraints that we work within. I think there's quite a lot of warm feeling in the room towards some of the points you've made, but what do you think about how we actually start making significant change?
Thank you. Jenny Wynne, Bishop Grosseteste University up in Lincoln. Thank you, it was a really enjoyable talk. I just wondered, in your opinion, the new early careers framework that's coming in, the new 2-year NQT, is that going to have a positive impact?
Yeah. So I'll answer Jenny's question first. I think the early careers framework is one of the best bits of policy work the DfE has done. And they've got the money for it. The challenge will be to get schools. We know that 30% of newly qualified teachers don't get any mentoring. So the challenge will be to make sure they do get the mentoring, they do get the extra time off, they do get the support and development. But in its intentions and in its profile, I think it's a really, really effective piece of policy development. I don't often say that. Can it please be noted that I've said the government had a really effective... And how do you get the radical change you need? Well, it's political. If we... You know, we've got an election. You might be in an election-free zone, but I'm not. We've got an election coming up in 6 weeks' time, and there's a radical change in travel advocated. So if you're looking at the policies of the parties, you'll find great convergence between Labour and Lib Dem in terms of approach to assessment, approach to Ofsted, abolition of Ofsted by the Labour and the Lib Dems and the Greens, or you've got the Conservatives, which is continue on the current situation, on the current path. We're not politically affiliated. I'm not telling you how to vote, but have a think.
On that